Robert had always been a skeptic when it came to tales of the supernatural. As a journalist, he had a healthy dose of skepticism and an unshakable faith in logic and reason. But all that changed when he met Amy. Amy was a researcher who specialized in urban legends and folklore. She had a fascination with the unexplainable and the mysterious. When she told Robert about a creature known as the Rake, he was dismissive at first. But as she began to describe the creature, he found himself becoming increasingly intrigued. According to Amy, the Rake was a hairless, humanoid creature with long claws and the ability to move silently. It was said to attack people in their homes, causing extreme fear and terror. Many who claimed to have seen the Rake reported feeling as though they were being watched or stalked, even when they were alone. Robert was skeptical, but he couldn't deny the chill that ran down his spine as Amy spoke. She had a way of making even the most far-fetched tales seem plausible. As he listened to her, he began to feel a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. Despite his misgivings, Robert agreed to help Amy research the Rake. They spent long hours poring over old newspaper clippings, interviewing eyewitnesses, and studying folklore from around the world. As they delved deeper into the subject, Robert began to feel increasingly paranoid. He found himself checking over his shoulder more frequently, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. One night, as they worked late into the evening, Robert heard a strange noise outside the window. It was a scratching sound, like something was trying to claw its way inside. He brushed it off, telling himself it was just a branch brushing against the glass. But as the night wore on, the scratching continued, growing louder and more persistent. Finally, unable to ignore it any longer, Robert got up to investigate. He peered out the window but saw nothing. Then, as he turned to go back to his desk, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. He whirled around, but again, he saw nothing. Heart pounding, Robert returned to his research. But he couldn't concentrate. The scratching sound continued, growing louder and more insistent. He tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Finally, unable to ignore it any longer, Robert got up to investigate. He peered out the window beside the door but saw nothing. Then, as he turned to go back to his desk, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. He whirled around, but again, he saw nothing. Heart pounding, Robert returned to his research. But he couldn't concentrate. The scratching sound continued, growing louder and more insistent. He tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Finally, unable to take it any longer, he got up and went to investigate again. This time, as he looked out the window, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A creature was crouched outside, its long, clawed fingers scraping at the glass. Its eyes were empty and soulless, and its mouth hung open in a soundless scream. Robert stumbled backward, his heart racing. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The creature looked like something out of a nightmare, and yet, it was right there, outside his window. He turned to Amy, but she was frozen in terror, staring at the creature with wide, unseeing eyes. Robert knew they had to get out of there. They had to get as far away from that thing as possible. But as he moved to leave, he heard the sound of scratching again. This time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the door. Robert and Amy ran to the door, but it was too late. The creature had already forced its way inside. It stood there, its eyes fixed on them, its long fingers twitching eagerly. Robert was paralyzed with fear. He couldn't move, couldn't think. All he could do was stare at the creature, willing it to go away. But it didn't go away. It moved towards them, its movements fluid and graceful, despite its hideous appearance. Robert could see every detail of its grotesque features now. Its skin was a sickly pale color, stretched tightly over its emaciated frame. Its eyes were sunken and empty, and its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. Robert felt a wave of revulsion and terror wash over him. He tried to move, but his legs refused to obey him. He felt like he was rooted to the spot, trapped in a nightmare. The creature moved closer, its claws clicking against the floorboards. Robert could smell its foul breath, like rotting meat and sulfur. Robert and Amy backed away, their eyes fixed on the creature as it stalked towards them. Its skin was pale and mottled, its eyes black and soulless. Robert could see its ribs protruding beneath the skin, like it was starving. But he knew better than to let his guard down. This creature was a predator, and they were its prey. He grabbed a nearby chair, trying to use it as a shield. Amy was sobbing now, her back pressed against the wall. Robert could see her shaking, could feel the fear emanating from her in waves. He knew they were in trouble. They had to get out of here, find help. But the creature was blocking their way to the door. It lunged at them, its claws slashing through the air. Robert swung the chair, trying to knock it back, but it was too fast. It dodged his blows, landing a vicious scratch on his arm. He cried out in pain, stumbling backwards. Amy was screaming now, her hands over her face. The creature was between them and the door, blocking their escape. Robert looked around frantically, trying to find another way out. But there was only one window, and it was too small to climb through. They were trapped. Robert's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. The creature was still advancing, its claws glinting in the dim light. He could hear its ragged breathing, smell the stench of decay on its breath. He knew they couldn't fight it, not like this. They needed to run. They backed away from the creature, towards the kitchen. Robert remembered seeing a back door earlier, and he hoped it was still there. But as they turned the corner, they saw the creature had anticipated their move. It was standing in front of the door, blocking their path. Robert's heart sank. He didn't know how much longer they could hold out. He glanced at Amy, hoping to find some courage in her eyes. But she was trembling, her face pale as a sheet. Robert hesitated, unsure of what to do. He didn't want to leave Amy behind, but he knew they had to move fast. He grabbed a knife from the counter, hoping it would be enough to defend themselves. The creature attacked. He tried to back away, but the creature turned, its eyes locking on them. It let out a furious roar, leaping towards them. Robert raised the knife, hoping to fend it off. But he knew it was too late. The creature was too fast, too powerful. It knocked the knife from Robert's hand, sending it flying across the room. Then, it turned on him, its claws slashing through the air. Robert felt the pain as they tore into his flesh, felt the blood pouring from his wounds. He stumbled back, trying to catch his breath. Amy was screaming now, her hands covering her face. The creature lunged at her, but Robert stepped in front of her, trying to protect her. He could feel his strength fading, could feel the life draining out of him. Then, there was a sudden burst of light. Robert squinted, trying to see what was happening. He saw a figure in the doorway, holding a flashlight. It was a man, dressed in hunting gear. Robert tried to call out for help, but his voice was weak. The man saw the creature, and he didn't hesitate. Aiming for its head. The beast let out a final howl before fleeing from the scene. He felt a sudden rush of relief, knowing they were safe. But it was too late for him. He could feel his heart slowing, his breaths becoming shallower. He looked at Amy, his eyes pleading. He wanted to tell her he loved her, to tell her to be strong. But his strength failed him, and he collapsed to the ground. Amy begged Robert not to leave her as tears streamed down her face, and she knelt beside him. But it was too late. Robert's eyes fluttered closed, and his body went limp. Amy cried out in despair, realizing that she had lost him. As he approached them with a grim expression, the man explained that he had been on his way home from hunting when he heard a scream from the nearby house and rushed to help. The man apologized for arriving late. He expressed regret that he had not arrived sooner, as he believed he could have prevented the disaster that had befallen Robert. Amy didn't even look at him. Her focus was solely on Robert. She clung to him, wishing that somehow he would come back to life. The man left to call the police, and Amy was left alone with Robert's lifeless body. She sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move. She couldn't believe that this was happening, that Robert was gone. When the police arrived, they found Amy still sitting beside Robert's body. She was in shock, unable to speak. They took her away, knowing that she needed medical attention. The investigation that followed turned up little evidence of what had happened. There were no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. It was as if the creature had simply appeared out of nowhere. The police assumed it was some sort of animal attack, but those who knew the truth remained silent. They knew that it was the Rake, the creature that had haunted their nightmares. Amy never fully recovered from the experience. She was haunted by the memory of Robert's death, and she never felt safe again. She became a recluse, rarely leaving her home. But even there, she was haunted by the memories of that fateful night. Years went by, and the memory of the Rake faded from public consciousness. But for those who had encountered it, the memory remained fresh. They knew that the Rake was still out there, waiting for its next victim. And as long as there were those who were willing to ignore the warnings, it would continue to claim lives. Robert's death had been a warning, a sign of the horror that awaited those who dared to cross paths with the Rake. But for those who refused to listen, it was only a matter of time before they met their own tragic fate. The Rake would always be waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike when they least expected it. And there was nothing they could do to stop it.